the same object shows up in the hands of gods separated by 3,000 years and half a planet. You can find it carved into the walls of a palace in northern Iraq, gripped by a winged figure with the muscles of a wrestler and the calm expression of a priest. You can find something startlingly similar scratched into a stone pillar in southern Turkey that predates farming, predates writing, predates the wheel. And you can find it again, carved into a slab of volcanic rock in the jungles of Mexico, held by a seated man sitting inside the open mouth of a serpent. 3 cultures, 3 continents, no accepted contact between any of them, and in every case, the object shares the same basic shape. A rigid handle arching over a squared body, flat along the bottom, held the way someone today might carry a bag through an airport. Online communities have taken to calling it the handbag of the gods, and for years it's been offered up as evidence for either a lost global civilization or visitors from somewhere far beyond Earth who left their fingerprints in stone. The argument has real pull because the underlying pattern is genuinely real. That shape really does repeat. It really does appear in places that, by any conventional understanding of ancient history, should never have had contact with one another. So the question keeps circulating. Why does the same handbag-like object show up across centuries and thousands of miles of separation? Here's what most people sharing those viral images never learned though. The ancient scribes who actually lived alongside these carvings wrote down what the object was. They gave it a name. They described, in their own ritual instructions, exactly what it was used for and, by clear implication, what it held. The answer isn't hidden in some vault or buried under a mountain. It's written on clay tablets, and it's been readable for well over a century. It's just that the real answer is quieter and, in its own way, more genuinely interesting than the one that tends to go viral. There's an important catch worth stating up front, because it changes how everything that follows should be understood. There is no actual handbag. Nobody has ever excavated a physical example of this object as a self-contained artifact you could set on a table and open. What exists are depictions, carved reliefs made by people living thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. So a headline promising that scientists finally opened the Sumerian handbag of the gods is being loose with the facts in a fairly basic way. You can't open a picture. What you actually can do is read the words the same civilizations left behind, look carefully at what the carved figures are doing with their other hand, and let the mystery resolve the way real historical questions usually do, slowly, through language, context, and the accumulation of unglamorous evidence. Start where the object appears most clearly, because that's where the strongest evidence lives. Travel to the ruins of the ancient city the Assyrians called Kalhu, known today as Nimrud, on the banks of the Tigris River in what is now northern Iraq. Nearly 3,000 years ago, this was the administrative heart of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, one of the most formidable states the ancient Near East ever produced. At its center stood the palace of King Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from roughly 883 to 859 BCE, a builder as much as a conqueror. His throne room was designed to overwhelm rather than comfort. Its walls were lined with enormous gypsum panels carved in low relief, originally painted in colors that have long since faded, functioning less like decoration in the modern sense and more like a permanent, unmistakable statement of imperial power aimed at every ambassador and tribute-bearer marched into the king's presence. Repeated again and again down the length of that hall are carved figures that aren't quite human, broad-shouldered, dressed in fringed robes and heavy bracelets, with great feathered wings rising from their backs. Some wear horned caps, the traditional symbol of divinity in Mesopotamian art. Others have the heads of birds of prey. These beings were called the Apkallu, sages from Mesopotamian tradition, primordial half-divine figures of immense wisdom said to have brought the foundations of civilization to humanity in the age before a great flood. On these palace walls they function as protective guardians, standing watch around the king, warding off evil and purifying the space around the fragile human ruler at the empire's center. And in the left hand of one of these winged figures, held down at his side with obvious familiarity, is the object at the center of this whole online mystery, a vessel with a squared body and a rigid, arched handle, carved with proportions tidy enough that a modern viewer's eye slides immediately into recognition. It genuinely does look like something you could buy in a shop today, and that single visual coincidence, an almost 3,000-year-old Assyrian spirit apparently holding what looks like a designer tote, is exactly the hook that's launched countless viral videos, because human brains are extremely good at pattern matching a shape to something familiar. But look again, and this time don't look at the left hand. Look at what the same figure is doing with his right hand instead, because it's holding something too, and almost nobody notices it. Raised roughly level with the figure's chest is a small object shaped somewhat like a pine cone, and it isn't simply being held. It's being extended, aimed toward something, in this case a stylized arrangement of interlaced branches and palmettes that scholars refer to as the sacred tree. The winged figure reaches toward that tree with the cone-shaped object in his right hand while the bag-like vessel waits at his side in his left. That pairing of the two hands is the actual key to the entire mystery, and it's worth holding onto, because it's the detail that quietly resolves everything once you understand it. For now, though, it helps to widen the frame and take in the room as a whole, because the Nimrud throne room wasn't a single carving but a full procession of them, repeated panel after panel like a heartbeat running down the length of the chamber. Anyone entering that space in the 9th century BCE wasn't walking into a museum. They were walking into a structure built out of stone and belief, engineered specifically to affect the person walking through it. Every visitor, every ambassador, every anxious provincial governor summoned to explain himself had to pass a gauntlet of these carved guardians before ever reaching the king. The message wasn't subtle, and it wasn't meant to be. You are entering a space protected by beings older than your ancestors, so behave accordingly. Ashurnasirpal II spent roughly a quarter century doing two things obsessively: waging brutal, methodically documented military campaigns, and building. He moved his capital to Nimrud and raised a palace on a scale so significant that, according to his own inscriptions, its dedication was celebrated with a feast said to have fed tens of thousands of guests over 10 days. The winged Apkallu figures on those walls weren't decoration in the way a modern painting might hang on a wall. They were functional. They were understood to be doing an active job every hour of every day, whether anyone happened to be standing in the room or not. Something that tends to get lost when images get cropped down online to just the vessel itself is that these figures weren't positioned randomly. They clustered specifically at doorways and thresholds, the points where one space transitioned into another, which in Mesopotamian religious thought were exactly the places where evil was believed most likely to slip through. They flanked the throne. They lined the corridors visitors had to walk. Their entire spatial arrangement functioned as a kind of permanent, tireless protective formula carved directly into stone. The Assyrians didn't carve things by accident at this scale and expense. They carved what they genuinely believed kept the empire and its ruler safe, and the object in the left hand, paired consistently with the cone in the right, was central to how that protection was carried out. The shape holds remarkably steady across panel after panel, across decades of carving by different individual sculptors. The squared body, the rigid arched handle, proportions nearly identical from one figure to the next. Someone was actively enforcing that consistency, which tells you this wasn't a trivial or decorative detail. It carried real meaning significant enough that getting the details wrong would have mattered. Now widen the lens much further, because the shape doesn't stay contained within a single Assyrian palace, or even within Mesopotamia generally. Travel roughly 500 miles northwest into the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, and you reach a site that has genuinely reshaped major parts of what archaeologists understand about the human past, Göbekli Tepe. Standing among its massive carved stone circles puts you at a site so old the dates barely feel real. Its oldest layers date to roughly 9,600 BCE, meaning the total distance back to today is closer to 11 or 12,000 years. This place was built by people with no cities, no writing, no metalworking, no wheel, and quite possibly not yet full-scale agriculture, hunter-gatherer communities who nonetheless hauled multi-ton limestone pillars upright and carved them with animals rendered vividly enough that they seem almost about to move. On one of those pillars, catalogued by researchers as Pillar 43 and often nicknamed the Vulture Stone, the carvings crowd together in a dense, clearly deliberate composition. Vultures with outstretched wings, a scorpion with its tail curled, snakes, birds, and several shape scholars still actively debate the meaning of. Near the top of the pillar, arranged in a neat row, sit three small figures, three squared shapes, each topped with a curved line arching over the body, forms that, to an eye already trained on that Assyrian relief, look unmistakably like the same object, carved roughly 7,000 years before Ashurnasirpal II was ever born. That gap deserves to be sat with rather than glossed over, because it's genuinely the engine driving this entire mystery. 7,000 years separates Göbekli Tepe from the Assyrian palaces, a longer stretch than separates those Assyrian palaces from us today. When those Turkish pillars were raised, the Sumerians didn't yet exist as a civilization. The pyramids of Egypt wouldn't be built for another 5 or 6,000 years. There was no empire, no scribe, no clay tablet, no plausible road along which any Mesopotamian idea could have somehow traveled backward through time to reach these particular hunter-gatherers. And yet there they are, three handbag-shaped forms sitting above a procession of vultures and scorpions, apparently asking the obvious question. How does the same object appear at both ends of a 7,000-year silence with no plausible connecting thread between them? There are really only a small number of honest ways to answer that. Either the shape was independently invented, more than once, by people who never met and couldn't plausibly have met, or the shape somehow carried a piece of knowledge that survived that enormous gap in some way we currently can't trace. It's in that narrow, genuinely uncomfortable space between those two options that more dramatic theories tend to take root, because once someone has already decided coincidence feels implausible, something more dramatic has to fill the gap instead. And the shape doesn't stop traveling there. It shows up again on the opposite side of the planet, in the humid lowlands of what's now the Mexican state of Tabasco, at a site called La Venta. This was a major center of the Olmec culture, often described as a foundational civilization of Mesoamerica, predating the Maya and the Aztec, known for the colossal carved basalt heads with their distinctive heavy-lidded eyes. La Venta flourished sometime between roughly 1200 and 400 BCE, placing it at least partly within the same broad era as those Assyrian palaces on the far side of the world. Among the carved stone monuments the Olmec left behind is one catalogued as Monument 19, showing a seated human figure with an enormous serpent coiling behind and around him, its open mouth arching over his head like a canopy or doorway. The figure sits calmly within that serpent frame, one hand raised, the other resting at his side, and in that resting hand, gripped by a rigid handle curving over a squared body, is essentially the same silhouette carried by the winged sage at Nimrud and carved in that row of three shapes above the vultures at Göbekli Tepe. The distances involved here are genuinely enormous. La Venta sits roughly 7,500 miles from Nimrud, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, deserts, and thousands of years of societies developing entirely independently, with no accepted evidence of any exchange of words, goods, or ideas between them according to mainstream scholarship. Once you line those three images up side by side, Turkey, Iraq, Mexico, the pattern genuinely stops feeling like a minor curiosity and starts feeling, to a lot of people encountering it for the first time, like a deliberate message. And once someone's attention is primed that way, similar examples tend to multiply, since human perception is remarkably good at finding a pattern it's already been told to look for. People have pointed to Maori oral tradition, which preserves the story of Tawaki, a hero who ascends into the heavens and returns carrying 3 baskets of sacred knowledge, an echo, in the retelling at least, of those 3 shapes arranged on the Turkish pillar. People have pointed to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, which include a sign shaped like a squared enclosure topped with a domed handle, read by Egyptologists as denoting a divine dwelling place or shrine. Line all of this up and the cumulative effect is genuinely striking. A Turkish pillar older than agriculture, an Assyrian palace wall, an Olmec serpent monument, a Polynesian myth involving 3 baskets from the heavens, an Egyptian symbol for a god's dwelling. Running through all of them is the same basic thread, a handled container, consistently associated with divinity, sacred knowledge, or the boundary between the human and the divine. It's genuinely difficult, once you've seen that sequence laid out, to simply unsee it, and that difficulty is exactly what gives more dramatic explanations their staying power. It's worth giving those explanations a fair hearing, because dismissing them outright without engagement tends to just make them more persuasive to people already inclined to believe them. The strongest version of the argument doesn't require aliens specifically. It goes roughly like this. Human cultures are wildly inventive and wildly different from one another. They build differently, dress differently, bury their dead differently, and imagine their gods with entirely different faces. When two completely unconnected peoples independently produce the exact same specific motif and attach it to a similar specific meaning, divinity, sacred knowledge, a connection between heaven and earth, that convergence seems to demand some kind of explanation. Pure random chance, the argument goes, shouldn't produce that precise a level of agreement across 7,000 years and 7,000 miles. Something has to connect them, whether that's a single lost civilization that seeded the same symbols globally before disappearing without a trace, or visitors from somewhere else entirely, remembered by dazzled eye witnesses who carved what they'd seen as faithfully as they could. It's a genuinely compelling narrative, and it's compelling precisely because it takes the underlying pattern seriously instead of simply dismissing it. But a strong theory has to survive the questions its proponents would rather not ask, and there's one question the lost civilization explanation has never adequately answered, a question simple enough that it tends to get buried under the drama of oceans and millennia. If a single global civilization once genuinely spanned the earth, teaching every culture the exact same sacred symbol, why is this handbag-like shape essentially the only thing they all apparently share? Where's the shared alphabet? Where's a common unit of measurement, a matching construction technique, a shared calendar system, the kind of loan words that bleed from one language into another whenever real cultural contact actually happens? Genuine cultural exchange, historically, is messy and abundant. When societies actually make contact, they trade far more than a single visual motif. They exchange crops, diseases, vocabulary, and entire pantheons of gods by the dozen. A supposed worldwide teaching civilization that left behind exactly one handled container and nothing else isn't really describing a civilization. It's describing a shape, and shapes, it turns out, have a well-documented tendency to be independently invented over and over again by people who never met, for reasons that are almost disappointingly ordinary. To understand why, it helps to stop staring at the vessel itself and finally look at what's in the other hand, because that's genuinely where the mystery unravels. For decades, popular discussion fixated almost entirely on the box, the handle, the flat base. Almost nobody paid attention to what the winged Assyrian figures were doing with their free hand. Once you notice it though, it's hard to unsee. Across relief after relief on those Assyrian palace walls, the Apkallu figure isn't simply carrying a bucket passively. He's actively reaching toward the sacred tree, or toward the king, with a small cone-shaped object pinched between his fingers, raised and angled in exactly the gesture of someone about to flick liquid through the air. That object has a documented name too. Assyriologists, working from the cuneiform ritual texts themselves, identify it as a mullalu, a purifier or sprinkler, and the vessel in the other hand as a bandadu, essentially an ordinary bucket. The moment you pair those two objects together, the entire scene changes register completely. This isn't a god clutching some mysterious container of forbidden power. It's a priestly or divine figure captured mid-ritual, a ritual that's actually well documented and reconstructible. The bucket held a consecrating liquid, most likely water, possibly infused with oil or some fragrant additive. The cone-shaped sprinkler was dipped into that liquid and shaken toward whatever was being ritually purified, scattering droplets in essentially the same gesture a priest in numerous later religious traditions would use to sprinkle holy water. It isn't evidence of impossible ancient technology. It's a purification kit, captured in stone at the exact moment of ritual use. This is the part worth stating plainly, because it rarely makes it into the viral retellings. The Assyrians told us what this object was. They wrote it down. The bandadu appears repeatedly in their own ritual texts as an entirely ordinary word for an ordinary bucket, the same kind of vessel a worker might use to haul water or mud. The mullalu appears alongside it in those same texts, and the pairing, the gesture, the sacred tree, the flanking guardian figures, all of it is internally consistent and repeated across multiple sites with the reliability of an established liturgy, because that's essentially what it was. When residue analysis has been performed on surviving metal buckets recovered from palace excavations, the traces found have generally pointed toward that same mundane explanation: water deposits and plant matter consistent with purification rituals rather than any exotic or unexplained chemistry. Nobody needs to metaphorically open a magical handbag here. The answer was carved directly into the wall the entire time. Sitting in the second hand, almost nobody bothered to follow. So why does a similar-looking silhouette turn up at Göbekli Tepe and on an Olmec monument across an ocean, if the Assyrian version simply depicts a bucket? This is where the honest answer turns out to be stranger and more genuinely human than any alien explanation. Picture the basic practical problem being solved. You need to carry liquid. You want to lift it without spilling it, without getting your hands soaked, without needing to set it down constantly. There are only so many workable shapes that solve that specific problem. A vessel to hold the volume, a flat base so it can stand upright when set down, and an arched handle rising over the top so a hand can grip and lift it without touching the contents directly. Squared body, curved handle. That's essentially the shape a human hand arrives at almost immediately when it needs to solve that exact problem. Different peoples, separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, independently reinvented that same basic solution for the same unremarkable reason they also all separately invented pottery, needles, and the wheel. Because the underlying problem was fundamentally the same, and solutions to a shared, simple problem tend to resemble one another. Once you look closely at the actual context surrounding each carving, rather than just the silhouette, the apparent matches start to dissolve into something considerably less mysterious. The shapes on that Turkish pillar sit among vultures and scorpions in a scene researchers genuinely can't yet fully interpret. The object in the serpent's frame in Mexico belongs to a distinctly Mesoamerican world of feathered deities and rain-focused ritual traditions that owe nothing structurally to the Tigris River Valley. The Egyptian dwelling place symbol and the Maori story of three sacred baskets each grew from their own independent cultural soil, their own mythology, their own specific reasons for existing. Line the silhouettes up visually and they appear to agree. Read the actual surrounding context of each one and that apparent agreement mostly dissolves into several separate, self-contained local meanings that simply happen to converge on the same practical, easy-to-invent shape. But an honest account has to slow down here rather than rushing toward a tidy conclusion, because that explanation genuinely resolves the Mesopotamian case without fully resolving all of them. Göbekli Tepe is the one piece of this puzzle that retains real, unresolved power. Pillar 43 was carved somewhere around 11,600 years ago by people who had not yet developed writing, agriculture, cities, or formal kingship. There's no accompanying ritual text to consult. No scribe who left behind a word explaining what those three shapes meant to the specific community that raised that particular stone. The convergent design explanation tells us those hunter-gatherers could plausibly have arrived at a handled vessel shape entirely on their own, simply by solving the same basic practical carrying problem everyone eventually solves. It doesn't tell us what they actually believed that shape represented, or why they placed it directly above a procession of dangerous animals, or whether it carried anything close to the specific ritual meaning a similar shape held for a man standing in Nimrud 7,000 years later. On that pillar, the shape itself is genuinely real, and its underlying meaning remains genuinely unknown, and an honest investigation has to leave that particular question open rather than dressing up an absence of evidence as a confident answer. So here's where the story actually lands. The handbag of the gods was never really opened, because there was never a single handbag to open in the first place. The Assyrian object has a documented name, a documented ritual partner, a documented purpose, and a fully reconstructible ceremonial function. It's a holy water bucket held alongside a ceremonial sprinkler, and that particular mystery is about as thoroughly solved as the ancient past ever allows anything to be. The scattered echoes of a similar shape across other, unconnected cultures are mostly the fingerprint of an extremely practical design that human beings, faced with the same basic problem of carrying liquid, have independently rediscovered again and again throughout history. And underneath all of it sits one genuinely open question, carved into a hillside in Turkey older than recorded history itself, quietly refusing to fully explain itself just yet. It may be that human cultures really have forgotten more than modern scholarship has managed to recover. Or it may simply be that we keep mistaking the ordinary, practical shapes our own hands have always reached for as messages sent from somewhere else entirely.